Today, we're diving straight into a monumental shift in history. We're looking at the absolute bedrock of modern India's constitution, the wildly complex and fascinating socio-religious reform movements of the 19th century.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture a sprawling, 3,000-year-old civilization. Unmatched heritage, right? But by the 18th and 19th centuries, it had basically stagnated. Suddenly, this totally static society gets a massive shock to the system. Domination by a foreign power, the British. So how on earth does a civilization respond to an existential shock like that? How does it wake up?
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, a society ripe for reform. Then, the ideological awakening, followed by reformers versus revivalists. Finally, we'll hit the two massive battlegrounds, the fight for women and the struggle against caste.
Starting off with part 1, a society ripe for reform and the catalyst for change.
So while 18th century Europe was basically buzzing with scientific enlightenment, Indian society was caught in this really obstructive web. The reformers themselves saw this. They looked around and saw a society steeped in magic and superstition. Priests held overwhelming influence, totally reinforced by idolatry and a strict monopoly on scriptural knowledge. It effectively trapped everyday people in blind faith. But here's a really fascinating nuance about the impact of British rule. Check out this quote. "The socio-cultural regeneration of the India of the 19th century was occasioned by the colonial presence, but not created by it." Think about that. British colonization was the catalyst, sure. It was a massive shock to the system. But the actual drive to fix these internal weaknesses, that energy came entirely from within, driven by a brand new awareness among enlightened Indians.
Let's move to our next section and see how this builds. The ideological awakening, the mindset of the new middle class. This whole charge was led by a really unique new Indian intelligentsia. See, unlike the European middle class, which was built heavily on trade and industry, the Indian middle class couldn't really do that. Industry was firmly in British hands. Instead, they were rooted in government service, law, education, journalism, and medicine. So they were armed with modern Western education and professional experience, which gave them a very sharp analytical lens to examine their own society.
And they brought 3 specific intellectual criteria, like intellectual weapons, to this fight. Number 1, rationalism. They started judging traditional practices using pure logic, not just blind faith. Number 2, religious universalism. Leaders argued that all prophets basically shared the same fundamental din or faith, pushing common human values over dividing identities. And number 3, humanism. A massive shift away from just seeking salvation in the afterlife towards actual human progress and worldly welfare right here and now.
So, the crucial point is, applying this rationalism was a dangerous paradigm shift. It meant evaluating literally everything based on its social utility. If a practice didn't actually serve society, it got questioned. They were replacing blind faith with logic, and even, get this, repudiating the absolute infallibility of ancient sacred texts. For the first time, people were really encouraged to ask why.
Moving on to part 3, reformers versus revivalists. 2 streams, 1 goal.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that not everyone agreed on how to answer that why. You basically had 2 distinct streams. On one side, the reformist streams like the Brahmo Samaj and the Aligarh movement, they looked forward, relying on reason and integrating modern ideas. On the other side, the revivalist streams like the Arya Samaj and the Deoband movement, they looked backward, relying heavily on an appeal to the lost purity of ancient traditions. They wanted to strip away recent corruptions and get back to their roots.
But, and this is key, neither stream wanted a total break with tradition. Despite their totally different methods, both camps sought an alternative cultural ideological system. They both wanted a new direction of social reform to regenerate traditional institutions. They just used the past as a tool to fix the present in 2 completely different ways.
All right, section 4, the fight for women, breaking the domestic chains.
And this brilliantly illustrates our first major battleground. Mirror these historical struggles with the basic rights we honestly just take for granted today. You can see the direct link between severe societal ills and the reformers' systematic solutions. Women were completely suppressed by purdah and early marriage, banned from remarrying, or tragically subjected to the practice of sati. In response, reformers hit back hard, promoting individualism, fighting for widow remarriage, the absolute abolition of sati, and relentlessly pushing for educational facilities for girls. Why was this specific fight for women so absolutely crucial to them? Well, it boils down to this quote: "No country whose females were sunk in ignorance could ever make significant progress in civilization. Reforming the domestic sphere wasn't just a side project, it was the absolute prerequisite. If mothers, the initial socializers of the next generation, were kept in the dark, the whole nation would stay paralyzed. Reforming the home was literally step one to reforming the entire subcontinent."
Which brings us to our fifth pillar, struggle against caste, dismantling entrenched exploitation.
Much like gender inequity, the rigid caste system drew its power from deeply entrenched religious interpretations. The most extreme manifestation of this exploitation was untouchability. As the historical sources lay out, the disabilities forced upon the scheduled castes were humiliating. People were banned from public roads, temples, community water tanks. This was a harsh, everyday reality based entirely on the inherently undemocratic principle of inequality by birth.
But here is a fascinating twist. While reformers were fighting this ideological war, the British administration inadvertently created a modernizing landscape that naturally started eroding these rigid boundaries. The creation of private property shook up traditional village caste hierarchies. Modern commerce, urbanization, and honestly just the physical reality of sitting next to someone on a new railway train began breaking down social silos. Add in equality before the law and a uniform judicial system and secular modern education, and the old scriptural monopolies just began to crack. Even so, the ideological fight was the main event. Organizations used that new weapon of rationalism to go right after the rigid hereditary basis of caste and traditional interpretations of the law of karma. Instead of just accepting lifelong exploitation as some sort of punishment for a past life, reformers called on people to work for betterment in the real world, right now. It wasn't just about salvation after death anymore. It was a total call to action.
And these incredible 19th century movements, they didn't just fade into the history books, they literally built the foundation for the future. The ideals of equality, humanism, and rationalism fought for by these early reformers went straight into Free India's constitution, which officially abolished untouchability and made discrimination totally unlawful.
So, to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really think about. These reformers achieved monumental things, right? They shifted the mindset of millions and laid the groundwork for a modern nation. But looking at society today, we have to ask, did these reforms truly erase the deep-seated divides of this ancient civilization? Or did they just force those divides to evolve for a modern era? It's a huge question and definitely one worth keeping in mind as we continue to study this history.